Welcome to everybody. We begin the second part of our meeting of today that is devoted to the keynote lectures. The first lecture is the lecture by Professor Massimo de Giuseppe. Massimo is a dear friend, but it's not this the reason, of course, why he is here this evening. He is full professor of contemporary history at the Department of Humanities at the University in Milan. He is also dean of the Faculty of Arts, Fashion and Tourism, and director of the Research Center Culture and Science of Sustainability. Especially is a scholar of international history, social, religious, and peace movements, and this is the reason why he is here today with us. He has studied the relationships within institutions, society, and religion between America and Europe, with particular attention to the case of Mexico and Central America. But he has also intensively worked on personalities, groups, and associations linked to the peace movement, third worldism, international cooperation, and the protection of human rights. He has published many books, for example, on Giorgio La Pira, the mayor of Florence, who was fully engaged in world peace activities. He is member of the scientific committees of many authoritative journals. The title of the keynote lecture of today is Christian Cultures and Peace in the Cold War Years. So thank you again, Massimo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Renato. Thank you. It's nice to be back here in Istituto Sturzo. And thanks to Paolo also for the invitation, and to Loredana for the nice introduction. I think I will try to, it's a very big, big theme topic, the title of this keynote speech, but I will try to build three parts of this speech. The first one is a sort of introduction, a very short introduction titled Religion and Cold War in Transnational Perspective, that tries to answer the question of Renato and the idea to insert the studies around Catholic pacifism during the Cold War inside the more big picture of historiography and transformation of the studies. The second part, or maybe the first part of the speech, is related to, I think I try to build two periodization impacts. The first one is around the 54 transformation in the mentality and approach of the Catholics to the peace issues related mainly to the anti-nuclear movement issues. And I think that 54 is a very important turning point moment for various issues, not only related to the changes of the Cold War, the changes of the technology of the atomic and H-bomb with the Bikini experiments, the changing of the relation between politics, public opinion, and scientists in a more global ways, and for what we have seen with Guido Formigoni many years ago, working together with the Primo Mazzolari documents in the Primo Mazzolari archive, also the change of a sort of permission inside the Catholic war of talking about peace and peaceful issues. And the last part of my speech will be around another time of transformation. The second turning point is identified by me from the post-Cuban Missile Crisis, and I will try to focus inside the relation between two different actors of this global connection around pacifism inside the Catholic world that are Giorgio Lapira, the mentioned Giorgio Lapira, in the last years of his presence as Mayor of Florence, 62-65, and on the other side, Thomas Merton, a man who not only was very pivotal in the transformation of the Catholic approach to the peace issues and the nuclear, anti-nuclear mobilization, but also with the capacity to be a big presence in the public debate outside of the Catholic borders. Lapira, not so heavily like Merton, but the two had the capacity to go outside of the border of intra-Catholic discourse, as Renato told us in the introduction. So I will start with a short introduction of religion and Cold War in the transnational perspective. In the tradition of the Cold War studies, the theme of religious presence in politics and the interconnection between religious issues and social issues has gained increasing importance over time. For a long time, studies have focused mainly on national perspectives, paying particular attention to nation-building processes and the political impact of actions by groups, movements, parties, unions, religious, secular, overly confessional associations. Think, for example, of the traditional studies on the relationship, especially or overly in Italy, between the Christian Democratic Party, La Democrazia Cristiana, the United States on one side, the ecclesial institution, the Vatican, the religious policies on the other side. Or think to the policy adopted in some Eastern Bloc countries under the influence of Soviet Union state atheism, or the use of religion as both a tool of resistance and repression in various Latin American dictatorship countries. In the first volume of the Cambridge History of the Cold War, paying attention to the geopolitical, ideological, and socio-economical dimension of the breeding ground in which the bipolar dispute was born, it emphasized the weight of religion both in the emerging superpowers and their respective areas of influence. Reflected on the multifaceted nature of bipolarity. For example, Ad Arne Westad, in his recent book, The Cold War Award, the history not so recent now, insisted on these elements which perhaps has been too long taken for granted. Wrote Westad, the role of religion is important both in the American and Russian side. While the position of organized faith was already in decline in Europe and in many other places too, by the end of the 19th century, Russian and Americans still saw religions having a central place in their lives. In a certain sense, there were similarities between American evangelical Protestantism, the old one Protestantism, the Methodist, the Presbyterian, not the new evangelical of the second part of the 50s and the 60s, some elements that nowadays are studied by Mario Del Pero, for example, and Russian Orthodoxy. Both emphasized theology and certainly of faith above what was common in other Christian groups. Being unconcerned with concept of original sin, both believe in the perfectibility of society. Most importantly, both evangelical and Orthodox believed that their religion inspired their politics in the direct sense. They alone were set to fulfill God's plan for mankind, also in the atomic age of the Cold War. This antithetical dualism between modernization processes and the persistence of religious elements, that I think is a very important theme to understand the role of Catholic pacifism inside the Cold War, that seemed to animate in Western analysis the two superpowers emerging from World War II, despite coming from different historical perspectives and experiences, contains elements common to the distinct processes of the 20th century secularization. Secularization is a big issue for a methodological analysis of this kind of studies. The dualism among the high protagonists of the Cold War, in fact, intertwined with a series of complex regional and national dynamics that characterize the various stages of bipolarity. But inevitably, and with even more socio-political and cultural creativity, also reflected the internal balances within the components of the two blocs. Indirectly, it also touches the third world scenarios. I think we don't have time here to emphasize the third war approach, but I think that third war discovering during the second half of the 50s is deeply connected with the changes of the pacifism, especially inside the Catholic world. And as Michael Burleigh has pointed out, the religious theme is re-emerging with particular strength in the historiography, dealing with the intersection between the Cold War, decolonization processes, Third Worldism, contributing to the opening of an important strand in post-colonial study that moves well beyond the boundaries of Christianity and the other Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Islam. Touching on Asian cults, African animism, reopening the complex Pandora's box of new missionary activities and emerging syncretisms. In fact, one of the leaders of Italian Catholic Action and chairman of the UNESCO Executive Committee, Vittorino Veronese, whose archive is here, some meters from here, wrote in '56 in the introduction to a book by missionary Luigi Geddo of Pime, one of the main animators of the Pontifical Institute for Foreign Missions, who was a sort of Italian readaptation of the Mission étrangère française. The retreat of the white race in Asia and Africa and the rejection of any Western influence have logically led these peoples to consider, among other factors, the religion factor as an essential issue. Islam, for example, which had been in a state of near lethargy for centuries, is now regaining its primitive strength. That's in the middle of the 50s, before Bandung. However, these countries, which are freeing themselves, are seeking each other but have not yet reached true political maturity and are easily vulnerable to ideological influences of all kinds. Obviously, the big scare was the Red Scare, the communism inside the post-colonial areas, especially African and Asia post-colonial areas that were emerging in these ages. The retreat of the white race in Asia and Africa and the rejection of any Western influences logically led by these people to consider, among other factors, the religion element as an essential element of the peace mobilization inside the Catholic areas. Islam, for example, which has been almost dominant for centuries, again Veronese, is now regaining vigor. However, these countries that are freeing themselves, seeking each other, but have not reached true political maturity, are now in a new phase. And if Veronese, by transplanting a specific Italian anti-communism culture to a post-colonial scenario, invited Western institutions, the political, social, and economic world, to a more careful consideration of the relation between the missionary forces of the church and the colored peoples, how they used to call them, and called for international recognition of the universal mission of peace of the church, the unique peace actor in the vision of Veronese, Father Geddo in his book analyzed from his particular standpoint a series of critical relations between the ecclesial world and the experience of decolonization and the age of the H-bomb, with the nascent nationalism in new countries and with the reality of the Cold War as a total experience. Without too much paraphrasing, he already gave his own defensive interpretation of the spirit of Bandung, referring to the conference of the 29 Afro-Asian countries reunited in June '55 in Indonesia, which seemed to challenge the rigid bipolarity of the first phase of the Cold War, where he wrote, "An enormous mass is moving on the fringes of our Western world. What direction it will take on its path is still too early to say with absolute certainty, but it's essential for the future of peace of the world. But already at Bandung, there were ideas, intentions, unions that are clearly anti-Western." And that's a new scare for the vision of this kind of Catholics. But this danger is further aggravated by the fact that there are already those working tirelessly to channel these powerful forces. Communism, the satraps of the Kremlins that have launched a spectacular propaganda, economic and diplomatic offensive in the colored world, and disguised by peace elements. The big guns of international communism are now aimed at Japan, Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and Africa. Geddo, who was a very defensive position, in his concerned reconstruction of the last 3 years following the Korean conflict, which was based on a rigid bipolar division of the world, shaped by Cold War culture and ideology, also included among the emerging dangers for the peace of the world the state-sponsored secularism promoted within the framework of Nasser pan-Arabism and Nehru socialism reforms. In the face of his massive ideological offensive, he continued, "We, the real Catholics of the West, are almost exclusively concerned with defending ourselves. That's the real mission of peace. Yet it would be necessary today to go on the counter-offensive in order to wrest ideological dominance over the pagan masses from communism." That's a very defensive position, obviously. The issue raised by the Lombard missionary is particularly delicate because it touches the role of churches and the faithful, not only in relation with the intertwining of bipolarism and post-colonial scenarios, but also more generally in relation to the peace-war dualism that would have fueled the new initiatives and movements both within and outside the church, and within and outside the parties, the Christian parties, as highlighted by Daniele Menozzi in relation to the gradual and difficult abandonment of the theory of just war by the Catholic magisterium, la guerra giusta. As demonstrated by the experience, are themes that were deeply analyzed by Renato. As demonstrated by the experience of the Oxford Famine Committee Relief, universally known as Oxfam, founded in Oxford in an Anglican context in 1942, the Milanese Association ONG, nowadays Manitese, established by 4 religious congregations in Milan, or in different terms, the Peace Corps within the Kennedy-era Alliance for Progress in the 60s and the 70s, the religion question would intersect and in some cases intertwine with very logic behind Western development policies and the resulting genesis of non-governmental organization, indirect protagonist of the ground in distinct stages of the Cold War and the peace mobilization. That's a sort of introduction that would like to connect the elements of the mobilization for peace outside of the classic analysis of peace movements from the left or inter-religious peace movement like MIR or the MAST movement, connected with the new elements that are coming from a sort of globalization produced by the post-colonial experience of the post-Second World War. Now I will switch to the second part of the first part of my elements, the first periodization. I think that the impact of the atomic and the H-bomb during the 53, 54, but mainly 54, was very impressive for a changing of the attitude of the Catholics, organized Catholics and not also organized Catholics with respect with the respect of these elements. First of all, in 54, Primo Mazzolari, this priest, seminal in the creation of Democratic Christian Party, but a peripheral priest that was a very complex and long history inside the history of Italian Catholicism, and one of the first exponent of real pacifism. Primo Mazzolari started as a sort of interventionist priest during the First World War, changing his vision during the 20s and the 30s very gradually, becoming a serious anti-fascist, and during the 50s becoming one of the first, we can call Gandhian in some way, pure pacifist inside the Catholic world, one of the few pure pacifists in a classic categorization of the Catholics in Italy. He wrote in 54, after the Bikini experiment, what shall we do with these tremendous instruments of our mechanical civilization? We close them in a museum near the antediluvian dinosaurs, and when we'll be ready, brothers among us, if we still have the taste, we'll put them out. Not now, as we are diverted intelligences, natures almost demoniacs. The revolution that will disarm the man and will return humanity and freedom can only be careful with the goods and the intelligence. And Primo Mazzolari was really interesting between the second half of 54 and the first half of 55, because not only is when he's writing his main anonymous originally opera that was Tu non uccidere, You Will Not Kill, but also reflecting between the connection that I try to insert methodologically between post-colonialism and pacifism in the Catholic vision during this age. And in some way, we can think that the first part, that's a very basic subdivision, but the first part of the Catholic mobilization through the great peace issues after the Second World War and during the Atomic Age was characterized by a sort of unconsciousness related mainly to the unconsciousness of the impact of radioactivity. That was something that was really discovered only after Bikini experiment of 54. Soon after the atomic disaster of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for example, the Catholic reaction was very, very shy. L'Osservatore Romano, the newspaper of the Vatican, had minimized the risk, writing that producing the atomic bomb effects only within a few hours after its explosion were not in a real danger situation. And in an age dominated by the movement like the Conseil Mondial de la Paix, Partigiani della Pace in the Italian case, the Catholics were very shy, and only Primo Mazzolari, the founder of magazine Adesso and promoter with his friends of other initiatives, or some of the authors of the magazine Il Gallo, a project, another project related with Christian avant-garde movements, or some people like Maria Remidi or the mentioned La Pira, were connected with more international movements that were outside of the Catholic borders. For example, the Peacemaker of Mast, the War Resisters League, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the French Pax Christi, obviously inside the Catholic Wars, landed in Italy in 54, and who had a very important animator in Monsignor Luigi Bettazzi, not only, but one of the first important animator just during the end of the 50s, the first year of the 60s. However, in the months that follow with the thermonuclear escalation of the 50s, the Korean War and the experiments of beginning of 54 and 55, the introduction of new elements in the atomic rush started to upset the Catholic public opinion. Albert Einstein after the Bikini explosion inside the Catholic world. And it's interesting how the Pope Pius XII, with the Christmas message of 54, made a sort of admission to open to a Catholic official peace movement after many, many years of defense position with respect of the aggressive of the pacifists from the communist world. Even the Catholic world seems to be upset by the last developments of the nuclear issue. The Eastern speech pronounced by the Pope on April 18, 94 was a sort of first change and had already aroused great interest, not only in Italy. The Pope told year after year people are more and more afraid of a third world war and of a future made of new violent destructive weapons. Weapons that with their artificial and living isotopes can pollute the atmosphere, the ground, the ocean, even far from the areas directly hit by nuclear explosion. And that was a strange and curious and new approach of the Pope to the peace element. When the leaders of the nation will understand that peace cannot consist in an exasperating and costly relation of mutual terror, the most evident nonsense that rises from the pitiful state of things is this. Today policy, even if fear the war and the worst disaster, allow that is the only regulator of international relationship in a way they trust in what they chiefly abhor. The Christmas message of 54 lent itself into the different interpretation. And in 55, the Jesuit magazine Civiltà Cattolica reaffirmed the necessity to watch those pacifist campaigns aimed at confusing both people and politicians. Aldo Capitini, an old past priest, Giovanni Pioli, working with Capitini, tried to introduce the idea of an independent pacifism not related with the communist one. And Giorgio La Pira took personal step in this element. I think 54-55 is a moment when Catholics go outside of the very rigid division of the approach to peace, and there is a sort of opening to new experience. Pax Christi, the participation of some Catholics to the Vienna World Peace Council conference, the presence of Catholics in the World Peace Assembly in Helsinki in May 22 of 1955, titled Disarmament and Atomic Weapons, a New Peace Movement, the presence of Umberto Zappulli, member of the National Council of the Christian Democratic Youth, invited as an observer that was suspended from Democratic Christian Party, the case of Chiarante, Boiardi, cooperators with Franco Rodano, Melloni, Bartezzaghi, on a newborn weekly magazine, Il Dibattito Politico, suspended for 4 months. And in a very delicate transformation and intertwined pervasivity of international policy and Italian policy. On August 55, for example, 10 years after the tragedies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Geneva became seat of the International Conference for the Pacific Utilization of the Atomic Power, and Dag Hammarskjöld invited also 160 scientists and seven Catholic scientists that represented an international delegation headed by Professor Giordani, president of the Italian National Committee for Nuclear Research. So it's a sort of transformation through an anti-nuclear consensus in the age that before the Sputnik, before the entrance in the inter-ballistic missile age, is producing some important element. In the Easter message of 56, Pio XII felt the need to talk of the atomic risk again in order to state the super parter position of the old super parter's position of the Church of Rome, and directly criticize the nuclear policy of the superpowers and call for an action of the Catholics for peace. He also mistreated the scientific community, guilty of progress that was explicitly described as a suicide. The position of the Holy See turned into diplomatic undertaking a year later when Pio XII sent a note with strong moral admonishment to a Japanese professor, Matsushita, who had been sent to the Vatican by his government to have a response regarding the intensification of nuclear experiments. So the public debate inside the Catholic world probably seemed to be more submersive in Italy than in other countries. Nonetheless, the nuclear issues has become a deep-rooted concept in public in a phase of rigid transformation of the pacifist mobilization. So I short a lot of details, and I came to the last part of my speech that is related to the La Pira-Merton encounter. In mid-October 64, Giorgio La Pira, the major of Florence in the last months of his charge, leading a small Florentine delegation composed of his assistant Fioretta Mazzei, young collaborator Mario Primicerio, and journalist Vittorio Citteric, arrived at Gethsemane, the Trappist abbey hidden in the woods of Kentucky, to meet Thomas Merton. The American monk, a member of the Cistercian contemplative trapper order, described that meeting in a letter to Sister Mary Luke Tobin, a very important person in the pacifist American movement, one of his most trusted friends, on the issues of peace and religious commitment. And Merton described the encounter with Lapira as a whirlwind visit. Indeed, this whirlwind mission to the United States, the first of a tour of American trips, 3 between the US and Canada and 1 in Allende's Chile, had been conceived by the Mayor of Florence as an opportunity to relaunch its distinctive concept of pacifism and democratic diplomacy and the Christian mobilization for international peace through the reaffirmation of the so-called Florentine thesis. The trip took place during the final phase of the US presidential campaign. The vote was scheduled for November 3rd, pitting Democratic Lyndon Johnson against a Republican Barry Goldwater, at a highly delicate stage of unprecedented transformation in the Cold War, the after-Cuban Missile Crisis, and with a new phase of the nuclear race. Many times we forget the Kennedy campaign was based more on the gap, on closing the gap, the missile gap with the Russian than on the civil rights elements. And the deaths of John 23, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, June and November 63, the widening Sino-Soviet rift, the Brazilian coup that put an end to João Goulart's development experiment in April, the acceleration of the Vietnam crisis after the Tonkin incident in August, were deepening the crisis of bipolarism and creating new conditions for a peace action. The removal of Nikita Khrushchev by Presidium, the Central Committee, which occurred precisely in those days, October 13 and 14, would raise further uncertainties. In this phase, very strange phase, this series of events will be interpreted by Lapira as one of, maybe in that moment, at the moment, the more important Italian Catholic visible outside of Italy as a pacifist, as a concrete threat to the first sign of detente, but also as a turning point destined to profoundly alter the logic of the Cold War and the intertwining of bipolarism and the fate of third world processes. The missile crisis of autumn '62, the launch of the Force de Frappe, were new elements for a new crisis era. In Lapiria's particular conception of pacifism and of intertwining of faith and politics, ethical commitment and multilateralism, pacifist mobilization and international diplomacy, dialogue between lay people and clergy continue to occupy an absolutely central place, as did attention the mobilization capacity, both operational and spiritual, of religious communities. According to the Florentine Major, the signs of war in East Asia and the spiral of violence in Africa, Latin America, were processes directly connected to the novelties of the thermonuclear confrontation. The impossibility of war, which risked being called into question by evolving logic underlying the new flexible response strategy and its idea of controlled escalation. From this perspective, we have to remember that the half of the 50s was connected with a big change of strategy in the US defense, and this part of the 60s connected with another big change of strategy that will become the flexible response. For this perspective, not only the Only See meditation role, but also the capacity of Christians to collaborate on multiple levels through public denunciation, pacifist activism, promotion of peace initiative, political lobbying, was deemly essential in the vision of Lapira, and also with a different approach in the vision of Merton. Hence, the encounter with one of the most critical and representative voices of North American Catholic pacifism, as Thomas Merton, proved to be in the previous 3 years, despite the limitation of censorship, and became an essential step in Lapirian strategy. Lapirian wanted to talk with the Americans, and Merton for Lapira was a sort of elements to connect with the American public opinion. It's interesting that this encounter started during the first months of the 60s, of the 62, at the time of delicate revision of the Florentine Major International Strategy. It was a long process that anticipate the journey of La Pira in the US, in the Trappist Abbey. It has been said so often, told La Pira in an article in 62, it must be repeated at the beginning of this short article that the world and human society are exposed to destruction. A possible destruction since today is relatively easy to become a reality for the entire human race by means of nuclear, bacterial, chemical agents employed separately or together. A probable destruction, and for the following reason: the possibility of destruction because a probability in proportion of the world's political leaders increasingly irrevocably rely on a particular policy, which relies more or less exclusively on the threat of using such instruments of extermination. And the first element of dialogue between La Pira and Merton was conscientious objection, obiezione di coscienza in italiano, and that be the center of La Pira's most rich interests. He was the only Christian Democrat to have publicly supported the first Perugia Assisi Peace March organized by Aldo Capitini on September 24, 61, modeled on the London Undermaston March by Lord Bertrand Russell. He had also allowed a public screening in Florence of Autant Lara tu ne tueras pas, which was censored at the Venice Film Festival. That affair would have generated a criminal complaint, later archivist, for La Pira, and an internal split within the Democratic Christian Party, with a strong reprimand from Andreotti and a new censorship by Minister Scelba, anticipating the strong debate and objection that between 62 and 65, with the Gozzini and the Fabrini case, who have involved more important figures of the new dissenting Catholicism, as for example Father Ernesto Balducci, Don Lorenzo Milani, other actors of Italian Catholic pacifism, generating a series of legislative proposals, including those of Lelio Basso and La Pira and Nicola Pistelli. Merton's 62 book about the nuclear risk seem perfectly in line with La Pira thesis on the ontological choice of the Catholics' rejecting of war tout court, which harked back to Gandhian position, or in Italy to the late Don Primo Mazzolari. It's interesting, for example, that La Pira tried to translate in Italy different articles from Thomas Merton. The most interesting one is one of 63, that it's a strong and very tragic reflection about the impact of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and another one commemorating the death of Pope Roncalli in the City Council, when La Pira evoked the sign of a miraculous unity that should move the Catholics to a new kind of pacifist activism. The idea was reached a new stage after the limited test ban treaty signed in Moscow in August 63. 14 months later, the meeting between La Pira and Merton would take place in an already different scenario, in which the fears foreshadowed by La Pira in the summer of 63 of a slide of the Cold War into a new scenario of increasingly independent regional crisis seemed to become concrete. The idea was that flexible response is a new kind of policy, but flexible response legitimate in some way local war. The one that in the US historiography were called a small war in faraway places. Local war that are part of the Cold War scenario for La Pira. And the interesting element in this connection between Merton and La Pira is the necessity of mobilize the Catholic pacifism not only against the nuclear race, but also against these small wars in faraway places. It's a sort of new connection of the 50s first link between third worldism and pacifism, that during the 60s, the global 60s, came to another level. And that's a very interesting. For example, in the dialogue between, epistolary dialogue between Lapira and Merton, there is a reference to the relief pacts between OTAN and Warsaw Pact to translate into a gradual de-atomization of the world, starting from the faraway places. At that stage, diplomatic efforts, according to Lapira, had to be increasingly direct toward preventing the risk not only of strategical but also tactical nuclear war on regional scale, especially in Asia, in Africa, or in Latin America, which the Indochina crisis somehow foreshadowed. From this perspective, drawing on Merton's insight, Lapira believed it was essential for all the Catholics to work towards an awareness of the new development of the globalization of the Cold War and nuclear confrontation, and the new elements that this was generating. The idea of the American trip in this way was therefore to try to raise awareness of the Florentine thesis in the United States and find suitable interlocutors to support it. On that journey, we have scattered documents in Lapira archive that we don't have the time to analyze, but I would only to make a reference to a new encounter in early '65. Despite the approaching final phase of the Second Vatican Council, which would conclude in December, the hopes raised among supporters of Kennedy's New Frontier and Moscow Pact seem to have been quickly dashed by a climate of testing of the new age of the Cold War, which particularly worried proponents of ecumenical pacifism. The first months of the year were particularly turbulent on various levels, while the situation in Vietnam seemed to be rapidly sliding toward war escalation. The Mann doctrine in Latin America, and a lot of different elements. In those months, Thomas Merton was experiencing a particularly lively phase of his faith. While he was experimenting with the path of hermitage, he was opening up in new terms to interreligious dialogue, to an engagement with Buddhism, and to rediscover the roots of Gandhian pacifism. The proposal of Merton to Lapira was an interreligious dialogue around pacifism. Above all, however, his capacity for dialogue grew. Even outside of the narrow ecclesiastical circles, the looser stance of censorship adopted by the order's new superior Ignacio Gillet contributed to reducing the restriction on the publication of Merton texts. That's a very strange element. Lapira is trying to publish in Italy what is censored in the US, and on the other side, Lapira is trying to bring in the US some elements that are not so fashionable inside the Democratic Christian Party in Italy during this phase of the 60s. That Lapira was in the margin of the party after the Vietnam experience in 64-65, and is opening a new season. At the end, in a very nice Merton letter to Lapira that in part was published in a number of Note di Cultura alongside an elaborate critique of an article by Jesuit Antonio Messineo, who had just updated his just war thesis, le tesi della guerra giusta e la civiltà cattolica, adapting them to the evolution of the open thermonuclear new scenario of the Cold War. In his speech on Santo Domingo, Lapira stressed the need for a multilateral and peaceful solution, questioning why the negotiation attempt led by Chilean President Eduardo Frei with the support of former Mexican President Adolfo López Mateos, Venezuelan President Rafael Caldera, and the Christian Democratic International had been undermined. It's interesting that there is a strong Catholic presence in the idea to create an no nuclear area in Latin America that then will become the Tlatelolco project some years after this. I will close because I think I spoke too much, but I wanted only to find, let me find the closing. Okay. In many years after, in 1973, when La Pira was outside of the Italian policy. La Pira will die in 77, but in 73 is very famous outside of Italy as president of the Fédération Mondiale des Cités Jumelées, but it's not very famous in Italy, it's not very famous inside Democratic Christian Party. And on the other side, Thomas Merton is entered in a new phase of fame outside of the Catholic war. His connection with John Baez, Bob Dylan, all this war that created a big fame of this Catholic pacifist. And in 73, when the winds of war in Vietnam were finally dying down, while the world was in the midst of the oil crisis on the brink of the Chilean coup, which would also swept away the old dream of phrase progressive Christian Democrats, La Pira recalled that meeting with Merton at the Trappist monastery in Kentucky and told, that visit had a meaning for me, a personal meaning, but also a meaning for the Christian consciousness of pacifism. It wanted to show that technological civilization cannot hold up if the second plan of the scales is not placed with the weights of contemplation and prayer, with spirituality, the weights of purity and grace. The technical without grace is the great risk for the humanity. This is what we say to Thomas Merton, and this is what I repeat today to all the Catholics in Italy, 9 years later and after so many painful events. Either humanity choose justice, peace, joy, the light of Lords, and unifies all peoples on the nuclear and technological mechanism, but will no longer be able to hold up a great ruin truly cannot cure. But I hope Our Lady will make the choice of grace. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to Massimo. Thought-provoking and inspiring lecture. I think we have perhaps some time to start a discussion among us. I have a first reaction, I think that this is a very, very relevant topic. That is Catholic pacifism and Christian democratic peace approaches. La Pira is a very interesting case. As you mentioned, he is a Christian Democrat, at the same time, just for his pacifism, essentially for his pacifism, is at the margin of the party. And he is a man who is opening the path to the pacifist approach that the Catholic world, not the Christian democratic parties, the Catholic world is about to choosing. I have always been impressed by one event in Italian history, but I think it's not only an Italian case. I think 1980, the Euro missiles crisis, a huge Catholic demonstration against the missiles that gathers almost all the Christian Catholic social movements in Italy, leftist and rightist, against the Christian Democratic Party, who is choosing yes, of course. So, what place to give to both realities, Catholic pacifism and Christian democratic realism? Because we have to remember that during the Cold War, pacifism is not anymore a good word. Peace is one of the slogans of the communist movement. We are the word of liberty. You are the word of peace. Well, better, contrary. The communists, we are the word of peace. You are the word of formal liberty. Pacifism is, in a certain way, linked to a bad tradition, the failure of the efforts again to stop Hitler. Munich, the conference of Munich in 1938, it remains as a sort of, yes, the League of Nations. So, peace is not a forbidden word among Christian Democrats, absolutely not. But one thing is to struggle, to fight, to work for peace through international organizations. That is the main Christian democratic topic. Another thing is pacifism. So my question is, how would you consider these two different trends and locate them in the Cold War history?
That's a big issues, but I think I choose exactly this connection between Lapira and Merton and the passage of testimony between Mazzolari and Lapira and the half of the 50s, because I think that's the real point. How can you create and legitimate a Catholic pacifism outside of the original vision of Pax Christi, that was prayer fundamentally? After it changes, obviously, but in the first part was praying for the peace, but not act directly politically in the political field. You can act in different field, but you can't act in the political field. Because I think that 54, after the Bikini, was a sort of magister legitimation, because I wanted to quote the two of the discourse of the two fragments of the discourse of the Pope, because it's the first legitimation after a strong battle against, for example, Mazzolari, that was very criticized and marginalized inside the Catholic world. Now there is a new space after this new stage of the atomic risk inside the Cold War scenario, that the Catholicism can move inside a pacifist discourse. Is a sort of legitimation to act, I think, in a very shy way, in a very realistic way, that produce an element very important for the realism of the Catholic Christian democratic parties, the Italian and the German above all, and with different characters, obviously, because the German is a totally different history. But in Italy, you have a very complex situation inside the Democratic Christian Party with relation. For example, it's very interesting to analyze the position of a strong Western defensor like Taviani. Taviani worked to a project of an European bomb and was a very strong defensor of the idea of OTAN, and a strong anti-communist, but at the same way made some opening about the Catholic concept of peace. So I think Lapira obviously is an avant-garde inside the Catholic world and inside the party. But I think at the half of the 50s, there is a new element that it's becoming. And it's an element that it's very interesting because not only has to do with the anti-communism, but also has to do with the complex relation between Democratic Christian Party and US, and US concept of the war. So it's a very changing situation. And I think that the entrance of the third world issues in the second half of the 50s changes the scenario, because when we come to the 60s, I think inside the discourse of Catholic pacifism, there is also the journey of Pope Paul VI to India, or the mobilization for Biafra, that apparently are not directly connected with peace, but they are preparing what will become Populorum Progressio in this new phase of the second half of the 60s, but there we are entering in a different era and a different concept of globalization also from the Catholics. But I think that Lapira and others are very strong defensor of the idea of the legitimation of a Catholic pacifism that can dialogue also with the realism of the party. I don't know if you agree, but
yes, I agree. Probably in the 1960s, the new protest culture changes deeply Catholic movement. It is what was a minority, an absolute minority in the 50s becomes in the Catholic world, not properly inside the party, but in the Catholic world becomes, if not a majority, a real strong component during the 60s. So
I remember very well a Congress of Young Democratic Christian in Milan and Palalido in '68, when if you see the slogan were against the militarization of NATO.
I imagine, but the Christian elite, the Christian democratic elite continued to be absolutely realistic. Realistic, of course, with brackets. They consider themselves to be realist people. Oh, well, please.
That's really interesting because I think Merton was not very well known in Italy because he was censored. If you look at during the 50s and the first part of the 60s, are very, very few. We have 4 articles by Merton published in Italy, one by la rivista La Morcelliana Humanitas, another one, other 3 by Note di Cultura, that was a Lapirian journal in Florence. So Merton is almost unknown in Italy during the first part, in the Catholic world, in Italian Catholic world. The interesting thing that Merton was rediscovering in Italy from the counterculture movement in the second half of the 60s and the first part of the 70s through the civil rights movement on the US. And the new discovery of the Catholic world of Merton will come only in the 80s through Rodolfo Cardenal, through the Trappist movement of the Sandinista movement and the participation of the Catholics in the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. In the big issues of the big presence of Merton in Italy, and if you see the translation of books, etc., is during the Sandinista age. And that's really interesting because you can see how the different Merton was interesting for Lapira to speak to the Americans, but was not known in Italy during the 50s and the 60s. Welcome.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Live.
Just to, it's not useful. Okay. So during the 60s, there is a sort of new influence of the cultural of the protest and new elements inside within the Catholic world. You know, you talked about the Vatican, the Council, Second Council, and my question is, there is, in your opinion, some contradiction inside the pacifist movements, the Catholic and the Christian Democratic too. For instance, considering the role of the theology of liberation in Latin America and the struggle against inequalities, against the dictatorships. So the pacifist movements was influenced by this internal contradiction. So pacifists in some key topics, but not exactly pacifists in other. So what's your opinion? What's your...
I think the second half of the 60s is really interesting in many ways. On one side, you have pacifist, purist movement in Italy that are interesting but very, very minimal and marginal. The Capitini movement, I think, a part of the March Perugia-Assisi mobilized, I think, not more than 1,000 people at all. It's a very marginal movement. If you see the Danilo Dolci movement, if you see the Lanza del Vasto movement that is more connected with French, these typical pacifist radical movements are very, very limited. Pax Christi, during the Bettazzi presidency, obviously take a new shape and a new presence inside other movements, inside Catholic Action, inside parochial experience, inside some elements of the Christian Democratic Party on a local level, but it's more seen as a sort of public opinion movement about some issues. The great deal, I think, it's on one side Vietnam and Biafra, and on the other side Latin America. And in Latin America, obviously during the second half of the 60s, after 68, after Medellin, transform the idea of Catholic pacifism. I made many years ago in Congress in Bochum in Germany a speech about the connection between Latin American mobilization, theology of liberation, and new pacifism, Italian pacifism, Catholic pacifism during the end of the 60s and the first part of the 70s. Because I think in Latin America, the Italian Catholics finds a lot of elements. The relation with US, the complex relation, the anti-Americanism of Italian is reactivated in some way, because Father Turaldo, when goes to the first time to Chile during the Operación Verdad with La Pira and Marcella Glisenti, Roberto Rossellini, invited by Allende, wrote a very hard article saying, here I've seen what is an empire. I've seen US in Chile. And there is a new vision that connect. You have to consider that Elder Camara, when came in Europe in 68, making a discourse in Palais des Portes de Paris, in front of 35,000 people, talking about the violence of Brazilian dictatorship, and talking about the idea of Catholic pacifism, because the thesis of Elder Camara was the thesis of the three violences. The first violence is the state structural violence, the second violence is the revolutionary violence, the third violence is the counter-state dictatorship violence. And he told, we don't have to take the arms, but we have to become the real pacifists that can be more dangerous for the dictatorship than the guerrilla, Guevarist guerrilla. So there is a big, enormous debate. I think the success of theology of liberation is not really connected to theological question. It's connected to social political question and pastoral question that are the real, the big issues. And I think in that age, between the second half of the 60s and the first half of the 70s, Latin America is the big center of the Catholic mobilization. A part of the movement, for example, I quoted Manitese. Manitese is really interesting because there are 4 congregations, Combognani, Saveriani, Pime e quella era la terza, una quarta, that reunite as a sort of classical missionality that help missionary to in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And in 4-5 years, it was transformed in a real laity NGO that is disconnected from the church, is very leftist in some way, not only because it's very, very article. But I think that that's a sort of global change of the mobilization of the Catholics, the end of the 60s and the first part of the 70s. In Latin America, especially South America, after it will become Central American during the end of the 70s and the first part of the 80s, are the big area of reference. More than Vietnam, that has other kind of approach. And it also is connected with the separation from the Catholic young generation support to the Democratic Christian Party and you.
Democrats are more involved in pacifist movement, of course, but with a very specific approach to Latin America. I mean, for instance, I have in mind a slogan used by young Christian Democrats in 1967, 68, more or less, and with 3 big names, Martin Luther King, Che Guevara, and of course, Camilo Torres. So 3 different, completely different figures, completely different personalities.
Yes, there is a famous King, Che, Torres, 3 different ways to find peace, something like this. With all the contradiction aside of this discourse.
Only in addition to this interesting dialogue, the problem is of a possible contradiction between the late 60s and early 70s is not only Catholic. If you are interested, there is a very interesting book by a very good American historian whose name is Gunther Lewy, on the American pacifism and Fellowship of Reconciliation, the Christian Pacifists International Association. The Quakers, the War Resisters International, that was not Christian, but was socialist, and refused even anti-authoritarian or anti-fascist military armed resistance, in the late 60s and early 70s, began to make exceptions. That is, not absolute pacifism in any condition, under every weather or sky, but in front of military repression, a war of liberation might be permitted. We cannot judge. So the concept of resistance. So it was a huge contradiction of the age, I think, not simply of one component. Okay, I thank to everybody for listening and intervening. We have a 15 minutes break, and we will start in 4:30 for this. Thank you again, Massimo.